Tonight, we are going to be discussing the past, the present, and the future of how plants are identified by professionals and members of the general public. And we're also going to discuss some of the myths or misconceptions associated with plant identification. But before I get into my slides, next slide, please. I think we're going to post, if it hasn't already been done so, is the survey that we're putting in there? Yes, okay, I see it on my screen. So we're going to ask people to take some time, and if you use a plant ID app to take this survey and tell us what you use, or if you don't, that's useful information as well. And some other questions in there about why you use the app, how you use it, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we'll leave that up for maybe, I don't know, a minute, 30 seconds. It's not too complicated. I think this survey is also going to be posted on Facebook Live, and there may be an opportunity to fill it out later if you're viewing the recording of the presentation. So I am ready for the next slide whenever we're done with the poll. Okay, thanks. So as Franny mentioned, I've been here since 1991, and as the oldest presenter this evening, I'm not going to try to take it personally that I was unanimously chosen to discuss the traditional or old school plant identification that was and continues to be used by most professionals. Now, later on, the youngsters on our panel are going to talk about newer methods of how plants can be identified by both professionals and members of the general public. But to start, of course, people have been identifying plants and other organisms around them well before this guy came along, Carolus Linnaeus. But for the sake of tonight's presentation, I'm going to start with him. He's a Swedish, for those of you who don't know, he's a Swedish botanist and zoologist who laid the foundations for the biological binomial nomenclature system that's still in use today. So when we see a scientific name used like Metrosideros polymorpho, or the scientific name for our native ohia tree, we can thank Linnaeus for creating the standard naming system that's still in use today. And he's also sometimes referred to as the father of modern taxonomy and ecology, and he may be one of the most famous botanists of all time until Kevin takes his throne. So next slide, please. So old school plant ID, what was and maybe still is required to get a plant identified? Well, some people might think you're, maybe a little bit intimidated by plant identification and think that you need a botany degree to be able to identify a plant. Next slide. And obviously that's a myth. It helps to have a degree, but it is not necessary. For example, this dapper looking fellow here, Joseph Rock, is one of Hawaii's most prolific and important botanists. He was largely self-taught. And in later years of his career, he started referring to himself as Dr. Rock. Some people portrayed him as a charlatan, claiming he faked his qualifications and conned his way into positions that he was not qualified for. And I can relate to that. But nevertheless, Rock's scholarly achievements in botany alone, not to mention his later anthropological work, would surely merit a PhD, even if he was never formally awarded one. So it is a myth. You don't need a botany degree to identify plants, but I think it does help if you have a really cool hat like we see here. So next slide, please. So what else has been necessary to identify a plant in the old school method? Well, an understanding of botanical terminology certainly helps. Pictured here in this word cloud are some terms from the botanical key for only two of our native species of Brigamia, pictured here, known as Alula in Hawaiian, or cabbage on a stick. And so just two plants with two species to key out generated the terms you see here. And some of those may be familiar to you, some of those you may have never seen before, but it's definitely this kind of language that is helpful in interpreting a key and identifying plants. Next slide, please. So, as I said, a botany degree definitely helps in interpreting something like this. This is a partial key of the genera of species in the Asteraceae, or the sunflower family, just in the Hawaiian Islands. And this could be even challenging for a professional botanist to decipher. So a degree in botany provides the training to understand this terminology. Otherwise, it's good to keep a botanical glossary handy, and even trained botanists do that, especially for some of the more esoteric or less commonly used terms. Next slide, please. So what else is required in the old school plant ID method? Well, access to floras and field guides. Professionally, all botanists would have access to an assortment of botanical floras and field guides, either ones they personally own, like my personal collection here on my bookshelf that's causing the shelf to sag, or access through either a university or other large library collection. Now, the limitations to this are many. For one, not everybody can afford to buy all these books or has access to a library that carries these kind of manuals. Now, if you're trying to identify a plant too and you want to do it in the field, these books can be pretty bulky and hard to lug around. A lot of them lack color photos and may have black and white illustrations or no pictures at all. So that can make identification challenging. Some of the botanical descriptions in these books are taken from herbarium specimens that don't necessarily reflect the full range of variation within a taxon. So you might not be seeing the measurements and things that you're observing in the field. And finally, changing taxonomy, new discoveries, new naturalizations can make the content of these books outdated or even obsolete. Next slide, please. So what else might be used in the old school plant ID method? Well, access to herbarium specimens is definitely a necessity. An herbarium, or the plural herbaria, is a collection of preserved plant specimens and associated data that's used for scientific study. Now, this is where the official plant specimens are kept for reference. We have an outstanding herbarium at the Bishop Museum on Oahu, and UH Manoa has its own herbarium, and many universities have their own as well. Now, the limitations to this are pretty obvious. Not everyone lives near one of these places or has access to the herbarium. Now, at least that was true in the past, starting to change because many herbariums are making their collections and their specimens available online by scanning them, so you can access them digitally. So that's starting to change, but being able to visit one in person and smell those preservatives is something that everyone should experience once in their life. So next slide, please. So aside from all that, if you wanted to get a field identification of a plant and you were a professional botanist or a highly trained field person, you would use an assortment of specialized supplies and equipment like those that are pictured here. A necessity to any field biologist or botanist is a hand lens to look at those really tiny parts that are hard to see with the naked eye. Again, I mentioned the books. Carrying those around can be a little bit of a burden, but having field guides with you is definitely helpful. And then rulers and other measurement devices to record plant measurements and also location can definitely help. Binoculars, if you're trying to identify parts of a tree or a plant that's out of reach, all of that can help with field ID. And the limitations, obviously, not everyone has access to all these items. And even if you do, you're not guaranteed to get an ID when you're in the field. The next slide, please. So all professional botanists are experienced with or know about collecting vouchers or plant specimens to get an expert identification. And so to verify a plant's ID or its presence in a new location, professional botanists are required to make a voucher or a plant collection that is then submitted to and stored in an herbarium like the Bishop Museum or the ones I mentioned previously. So to do this properly, botanists or field biologists need a whole bunch of specialized tools and equipment as well. And one item that's absolutely essential for this is the plant press, which is pictured here. And it's nothing too special about this. It's just pieces of cardboard held between a wooden frame and compressed together with straps to flatten and dry plant specimens so that they can be mounted on an herbarium sheet and then used for reference later. But, again, just like field identification, collecting plants in the field requires a bunch of tools and things that not everybody might have access to. And not everybody's going to go through all the trouble of collecting an herbarium specimen or a plant specimen either. One of my mentors, Art Medeiros on the island of Maui, when I was first starting out my career, told us stories of about how he would be in the field for a week or more at a time, collecting all these plant samples from some remote location, then coming back home, making specimens of them in his plant press, then traveling to Oahu to consult with the botanists at the University of Hawaii. And the one he often visited was Harold St. John, who the Botany building at UH Manoa it's named after him. And Art would get into discussions, debates about whether or not something was what he thought it was, a new species. And obviously, this isn't something that everybody can do. So this is something that is usually only, in the professional plant identification. Next slide, please. Another specialized device all the cool botanists carry is this item called the vasculum, which is essentially, it's just basically a collecting box for plants, typically in the form of a flattened cylinder or a metal case that's got a lengthwise opening and it's carried as a shoulder strap. And this is to collect plant specimens and keep them from getting crushed in your pack. So it's a pretty bulky item. Not everybody is going to carry one of these. The professional botanists might, but generally nobody else will. But it can be quite fashionable if it's accessorized with the right outfit, like this gentleman has, is demonstrating here. But otherwise, most people aren't going to carry something like this. Next slide, please. So let's fast forward slightly more into the modern age. What would the amateur or the non-professional botanist do to identify plants? Well, they could go through all those other things that I mentioned. And of course, there's some outstanding amateur botanists out there that do all the things I just mentioned. But for the most part, if you were just a casual, hiker or somebody who's interested in plants, you might, use the old school or the early version of a plant photo app, which is basically your camera taking pictures in the field. And then if you're lucky, you take it to a place like this old extinct photo map where you could get, instant development within a few hours or even a day, sometimes longer. And then you would be able to look at your pictures and get them identified. But next slide, please. The obvious limitations to this are that, you think you've got that really excellent photo and it's going to help you identify that plant. And then you get your pictures back and they look like this. They're blurry, the lighting is off, or for that case of that grass on the right, the wrong part of the plant is in focus. So you're not able to get those identifying features, to look at and get identification. So anyway, we're going to talk now about the modern version of Plant ID, and Kevin and Molly are going to discuss these new methods as well as some of the myths and misconceptions associated with them. So I will pass the baton now to the next speaker.
Hi, everyone. I'm recovering from a bit of laryngitis, so if I'm clearing my voice pretty often or my voice starts to die away, that's why. Moving towards the 21st century, we're introducing there's these concepts of plant apps. As we've defined them, they're apps on your phone where you take a picture of a plant and it tries to identify it for you. So this is a pretty big improvement over the methods Chuck described, where you get an identification basically instantly and often with quite some reliability behind it. And most importantly, it's just instant. So these apps work on computer vision technology, where there are different algorithms that process the image in order to extract information about the plant. Some of these apps also have information about watering and where you should grow plants. If some of them are specifically for house plants or gardening, where they'll identify stuff, but also help you grow it. We're going to focus on the identification aspect of this. So inside these apps is what's called a classifier model. So basically what this model does is take a picture of a plant and try to put a category on it. And the categories are species. So the app could have 10,000 species that it knows or 100,000 species, and it tries to find which species is the best match for the photo. Model is like fancy computer science lingo. It's basically just like a representation of a system. So in this case, it's like a computer representation of plants. So it's trying to represent all of these plant photos inside what we're calling a model. This technology wasn't specifically designed for plants. It's used for a lot of things like reading text in books, self-driving cars, medical, manufacturing. This is just one application of this tech. Next slide. So what happens when you take a photo and submit it into one of these apps? So we're submitting this photo on the left of these white flowers. So that the app will give oftentimes multiple identifications. So it'll give like a statistical output. These models are based almost entirely on statistics. So it can't say that it's 100% certain that it's this flower on the top. Maybe it'll say it's 90% certain and it's 5% that it's this closely related species. These models are never 100% accurate in any instance on any photo. There's always a statistical element to it. Some of these models will filter based on geography. So if you tell the app that the photo was taken in Hawaii or Oklahoma, it'll filter based on what species occur in that area and not suggest an oak, for example, in Hawaii where we don't have any. These models are also deterministic. So if you submit the same photo multiple times, you'll get the exact same output. But if you submit slightly different photos, you'll get slightly different outputs because it's not the exact same photo at the pixel level. Next slide, please. So in the background behind these apps is a training system. So like I said, this technology is used for a lot of different things. So in order to make it useful for plant ID, you have to train it how to know plants. So in order to do that, you need enormous quantities of labeled photos. So basically each plant is labeled with the identification with the species. So you have all different parts of the plant, different stages of development, different times of year. So we have flowers, leaves, bark, habitat shots, all of these get fed into the model, into this algorithm. And the training of these models is purely autonomous. There's no human feedback saying that this leaf, like this is the edge of the leaf, or this is what makes this plant different from that plant. The computer's making all of the decisions about what parts of the image are important. And so if an app is giving a strange ID, it's not because it was trained wrong by a human. It's because the computer decided something strange during this training process. Next slide, please. So what are the limitations of these plant apps? A poorly trained model will give bad IDs. So if you have a model which has a lot of mislabeled stuff in the training data, there's a lot of photos which are really bad or which are just like the wrong species, then the model won't know what these species actually look like, and so it'll give, it's called garbage in, garbage out. And I mentioned this earlier, taking multiple photos of the same plant may give different identifications because there's the photos are slightly different, then the model may find different things in the photos to use as to base on the identification on. This can also be an advantage because taking multiple photos, if the first ID didn't make any sense, maybe the next one will. And another thing, for a lot of these apps, we don't know what the training data looks like. These companies don't really want to release this data. And so some of these data sets might be pretty bad. We don't know what they look like or how many species are in them is another thing that we may not know for some of these apps. Next slide. So these are examples of some species that are missing, that are Hawaiian species, that if you tried to identify in any plant app, basically that exists, you would not be able to identify these plants because there's just not enough photos of them in order to train the models. common cutoff is like you need 100 photos in the data set in order to train a model. And a lot of tropical species don't have 100 photos on the internet. Even if you go onto Google Images and type in the names of some of these plants, maybe you'll get like 5 results. So they're nowhere near enough to for these plant apps to know them. Next slide. I think this is Molly.
Okay, can you hear me?
Can hear you.
Sorry, okay. So now we're gonna go over some plant myths. Taking a picture of a plant ID, of just a leaf is accurate enough for an identification. Sometimes there is no way, even if you have the leaf and habit and structure of the plant, that you will ever be able to figure it out. Oop, next slide. So here we have Caprosma species, also known as Pilo. It's a native Hawaiian plant, and it is notoriously hard to identify, if not impossible, without the fruit. Even if you have the flowers, it's still really hard to figure out what it is. But when I look at this picture, I can see that it has apposite leaves and prominent stipules. So I know those are like good characteristics of the coffee family. Next slide. So then we add in pictures of the fruit, and I can say this is Caprosma rhinocarpa. This is one of the first Pilo or Caprosma species that I learned in the field, so it's always very special to me. But so you can look at the fruit, and it's called rhinocarpa. And if you look at the end of the fruit, that's the rhino part, and rhino it means beak, which refers to the end of the fruit. Carpa means fruit. So I'm looking at the whole name, and I'm seeing at the fruit and the whole picture of it, and then I can identify it. Next slide. So here we have a picture of a leaf. It's distinctive. It's got a heart shape. I can see the way that veination works. You know, it's a cordate or heart-shaped leaf. So from this, I can tell it's a morning glory family, but that's all I can tell without any more flowers or fruit. Next slide. So we add in the flowers, and just from me looking at it, I can tell this is a Hawaiian sunset flower, Stichocardia berevanescens. It's a beautiful flower that's cup-shaped. I can see that the flowers emerge from the leaf axils. They come in these bright clusters of crimson with yellow and orange streaking. And then again, the large heart-shaped leaves. Next slide. So I put this into different plant apps, and at least iNaturalist couldn't figure it out. They got close to it. They could tell it was in the right tribe. So tribe is below family and above genus. So we're getting closer, but then I look at the other suggestions they make. African tulip tree, definitely not. So on and on and on. Those are not the right suggestions. So you have to sometimes just go to books, go to websites, and use your own botanical knowledge to find the correct plant identification. And it's a rare cultivated plant, so it's harder for plant apps to figure out. Okay, next slide. So here we have a picture of leaves, and I see three compound leaflets. Each 3 leaflets make up a leaf. And so I can tell that it's in the Fabiaceae family or pea family. And this is really never enough for artificial intelligence or plant apps to identify. And it's not enough for humans to identify. This is just, it's not enough information. So, but I did put it in iNaturalist, and they get me to the right tribe, but then they're giving me all different kinds of genus and species names. So we need to go further. Next slide. So we add in the flowers, and now we're getting a really close ID, and it's telling me the Vigna genus. So I used books, I used iNaturalist to identify this plant. And I mean, I got really close to it, but I was incorrect. Thankfully, I pressed a specimen the old school way, like Chuck showed, in a plant press. And so I thought it was Vigna Jose. And then thankfully, Kevin came to Hilo and I showed him my plant specimens, and he looked at it, and from his expert botanical knowledge, he was able to let me know this is actually Vigna Jose. So sometimes, you know, books, you can do all you want to like figure it out and think about it, and plant ID apps, but sometimes you just need an expert. Next slide. Okay, but sometimes it does work. So here we have a picture of a common leaf. We can see this pinnately compound leaf with medium dark green leaves. We can see it's an even number. So, I mean, I can tell what this leaf is just by looking at it, but I put it into iNaturalist, and they could tell right away. They could tell it's a senna, so they got the right genus. And then the next suggestion is Senna alata, which is a correct identification. Next slide. So maybe you don't feel comfortable to ask, to look in plant ID apps or look in books. Sorry, I'm trying to fix my screen. Okay, is that better? Okay, so if you don't feel comfortable with an ID, you should just ask an expert. So I think in 2020, we found out that Chromalena odorata, which is a noxious weed, was present on Hawaii Island. And we cannot be everywhere. It's a big island. So we did a huge social media push and asked people, hey, is there something weird in your backyard that you don't see or you don't know what it is? Please tell us. So we got at least 100 different pictures of leaves. Thankfully, I've learned enough about leaves to be able to correctly identify them 98% of the time. So on the top right is Chromalena odorata, which is what we're looking for. And as you can see, it's got longitudinal veins, kind of triangular leaves, and serrated edges. So if you look at the top left, we have HISC species. I just get it down to the genus level with that plant. I'm not sure of the species, it's one of two. But you can look at that plant and see that it's got a middle main vein that goes down the leaf, and then we have alternate veins or secondary veins that come off that middle main vein. So if we go to the bottom left, we have Myconia crenata, which used to be Clydemia hirta, but is known as Coster's curse. So it has the same longitudinal veins as Chromalena odorata, but you can tell looking at the Myconia crenata leaves that they're more teardrop shaped, they're less triangular, and they have a really prominent quilted pattern in the leaves. So then on the bottom right, we have Arthrostemma cellatum, which is a really common invasive weed here in East Hawaii. And it looks similar because it does have those longitudinal veins on the leaves, and the leaves do look somewhat similar. But one way we can tell the difference is there is no serration on the Arthrostemma cellatum. It's just like a clean edge on the leaf. So it's important to look at all aspects of the leaf. Look at the edges. Is it serrated? Do you see hair? Look at the veination. Those are great ways to identify a leaf. Next slide. So you also want to think about what makes a plant pop. Besides just taking a picture of the fruit, the habit, and the flowers, you want to think about other things that are different about a plant. So here we have Acna cerulata, otherwise known as Mickey Mouse plant, which looks a lot like at least one other member of the genus. But one thing that puts Acna cerulata apart from other members of the genus is it's got lenticles on the stems. So if you look closely at the stem right there, you can see kind of these white bumps. So that's a really defining characteristic of this plant. So you want to kind of take a step back and think, oh, what's different about this plant? What could help me identify it? Next slide. And then finally, you want to think about other things that you can't even see with pictures. So does it have a scent? Where did you find it? Did you find it growing in gravel or in a discarded pot in your yard, like a nursery pot? Does it have sap? Is that sap milky or clear? Does it have thorns? So this is a picture that everybody has seen. We've all eaten it and tasted it in our lives. It's lemongrass. I put it into, I think, all the plant apps that we tested, and nobody could identify it because it just looks like some grass with some flowers. Although I'm sure Kevin would say, I can tell what grass it is just by looking at it. But most of us can't tell. So had I said, oh, I read the leaves and it had a lemony scent, most people would be able to identify it. Okay, next slide. And of course, you want to show the best parts of the plant, but it can't be blurry. So here we have a red hot poker vine that I took while driving down the road. I was in the passenger side. So it's blurry. And then there's so much going on behind it. So no plant app can identify this. As a human, I can figure out what's going on, but artificial intelligence will never figure it out. There's a saying in conservation and botany that you spot, stop, and take a shot. So I spotted and I took a shot, but I didn't stop. So it's really important to give non-blurry pictures for identification if you're looking to confirm an ID. Okay, next slide. So again, taking a picture of a leaf is enough for an accurate ID. Next slide. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. Okay, now I think we're on to Kevin.
So our next myth is that plant apps are always accurate. And we set out to actually test this one. So we use these 5 different apps: iNaturalist, PlantSnap, Picture This, Google Lens, and PlantNet, which are some of the most popular plant apps that we've heard of. And we tested them using different Hawaiian plants. Next slide. So we did 70 photos in each of the different 70 photos of different species of plants and put them into each of these apps. So they're all getting the same species, so it's valid to compare between them. The most accurate app is iNaturalist, and that's why we've been mentioning this before. On average, it was 67% accurate on our 70 photos. The worst was Google Lens, which didn't identify a lot of the things, so it gets around 24%. And then PlantNet, PlantSnap, and Picture This were all between 30 to 40% accurate. So not super great for any of these ones. Next slide. We also ranked the different apps. So besides for accuracy, we decided to give them points as well. Because sometimes these apps, because they give multiple suggestions, they'll have the correct ID as like the second or third suggestion. So we gave them partial credit for getting it in one of those suggestions. So it's not just the first ID is the only way that they're getting points. So with that, iNaturalist is still well in the lead, getting more points than any of the other apps. And some of the difference between these bottom ones kind of equal out. For points, we also gave like partial points if you got the right genus of plants. So if it suggested a very close member, we gave it partial credit because it would still help you a little bit identify it if it gives you a really close ID. So next slide. And then we also tested different types of plants. So we tested common native plants. And for this one, iNaturalist was 10 for 10, or 14 for 14, with the native plant photos that we inputted for the common ones. So it was very accurate for common natives like Ohelo and Ohia, BIISC, things like that. I wouldn't say it's 100% accurate. It just happened that with these 14 photos, it got all of them, but it will definitely mess up eventually. But for the rare natives, iNaturalist only got 44 out of 100 points. And the other apps were really scraping the bottom with the rare plants. So the take home here is that these apps perform substantially better on common native plants compared to rare native plants, and that pattern should hold across the other groups too. So the next slide. We did the same thing with invasives. It's kind of hard to tell because the axes aren't equal on here, but on common invasives, iNaturalist got 99 points, so it was really good for the common invasives. But for the rare invasives, it was around 80 out of 100 points, not quite as good. Google Lens was still pretty bad at both of these, and the other apps did pretty decently for the common, and even the rare invasives, some of these did about the same scores, but didn't come close to iNaturalist. Next slide. And we also tested the apps on cultivated plants, and similar, 80 points. So it's similar to around a 3/4 accuracy rate for identifying these things. Google Lens did a bit better on these, but overall, iNaturalist is the undisputed king of plant ID apps in terms of its accuracy and ability to actually identify things correctly. I think that's all for me. You're still muted, Molly.
Okay, here we go. How's that going?
You're good.
Okay, thank you, Franny. So I don't know if everybody missed it, but Kevin said iNaturalist is the undisputed king of plant identification apps. So I just want to reiterate that again. But even when we use plant ID apps, even when we look in books or ask other people, how do we confirm if a plant ID is correct, whether it's by an app or by book or whatever? Next slide. So you want to, there we go. You want to take a step back and think about what you're looking at. So especially if you're posting a picture to iNaturalist, you want to say it's a plant because that's going to get you closer and closer to the identification. And the more you learn about botany and how plants' characteristics are similar, you can get farther and farther down the characteristic chain and get closer and closer to your identification. So the Melastomiaceae is a huge family. So we know it's a plant. We can tell it's a family by its characteristics. And then we get down to the Myconia genus, which is ever expanding. It's getting bigger and bigger all the time, thanks to new works with DNA and taxonomists and redefining the lineage. So Myconia has 1,000 species. So even if you can only get down to that genus, it's good to let people know or plant apps know that that's the genus you have to find it in, and then it's a lot easier to get to the species. Next slide. So this is a great way to confirm what plant family you have, and I think we're gonna put this link in the chat. So it's a Lucid Central Identification and Diagnostic Tool. So it's kind of like an access database, and you like say your geographical region, the plant type, how the leaves are arranged, the flowers and what they're like, what the fruits are like, how the seeds look like. So you can go down, down, down and whittle away on your identification and eventually hopefully get to the right family, or maybe just, you know, a few families. And from there, you can look deeper into it. Next slide. So this is one of my favorite resources. We all owe so much to Kim and Forrest Starr for all they've done for conservation in Hawaii. Since the 90s, before it was cool or was a thing, they've been taking pictures of plants and uploading them onto their website. And they characterize them by genus, species, and families. And right now they have over 3,000 taxa. I just asked them a few days ago, how many do you have on there? So it's over 3,000. So this is a wealth of information for us. So if you figured out what the family is, you can just search family and then look at all the choices and use your own botanical knowledge, books, whatever you have to like figure out, okay, that's the right family. And from there, maybe you can get to the right genus and finally to the right species. So say it's an acacia, you know it's an acacia, but you don't know the species. You type an acacia to the search bar and look it up and just look at the pictures and use dichotomous keys and, or just like websites, anything you can have for like good information and figure out what best will fit your needs and to how to get the best plant ID. Next slide. So I really love books still. These are 3 of my favorite books. So on the left, we have Weeds of Hawaii's and Pastures of Natural Areas. So I do work for the Big Island Invasive Species Committee. So I do try to prevent invasive weeds from forming, from growing, and I like to know what invasive plants are common here. So that is a great book to like figure out what's growing all around you. It's not going to give you early detection, but it lets you know by growth form, species, what kind of plants are around you, and it'll give you control information also. If you know the species of the plant, you can type that into your search bar and say that CTAR, and you can actually get each page from the book. But I highly recommend just buying the book. I think it's less than $15. I use it all the time. So in the middle, we have the Q Tropical Families Identification Handbook. And this is if you want to get a little more nerdy into plant identification. It helps you learn characteristics of each tropical plant family, just like the title says. So it's a really great book if you really want to learn botany and understand the classification system for different plants and their families. And then finally on the right, we have A Tropical Garden Flora by Staples and Herx. I use this book almost every day, but it's because I'm really interested in the narrative of each plant. It will tell us if we know who imported the plant, when they imported it, where it grows best, how to take care of it, and how it looks nice in the environment. So I'm not sure if it's in print anymore, but I looked it up on eBay or just on the internet, and it's still available. And I think it was about $70, but if you're really into plants, I say get it. Okay, next slide. So I don't usually like to recommend Facebook groups for plant identification. Eli Edney, I'm looking at you if you're still watching. I saw your comment. If you ask for a plant ID on Facebook groups, you're going to get maybe 5 correct answers and 5 wildly wrong answers. So how do you know if you're ever correct? Because people, for some reason, like to give wrong answers and then double down on them. But this group, I highly recommend. Plant identification. The title says it all. There is no discussion. Don't ask if the plant's poisonous, if it's edible, if it's useful in any way. That has nothing to do with this group. The group is all about plant identification. And because the rules are really strict, we can get real live identifications in real time, really fast from professionals in the industry. And then once you get the right ID, they turn off commenting. They turn off commenting so that nobody else can like keep answering. Because I think other slide, back slide. There we go. Still on this one. Because that's like something people do on Facebook groups, like, oh, it's mamaki. And like 30 people will say it's mamaki. Why do we need to say it 30 times? Just, we've got the right ID. Let's just go with it. So yeah, plant identification is a great one. Okay, so Dave's Garden is really great. It's great for cultivated plants, but also if you want to know what botanical names means. So there's the Searching Botanarary, which is a combination of dictionary and botanical names. So you can put in the species name, which is usually a descriptive name to the species name, put it in there and find out what it means in botanical language. And that's really great for understanding physical characteristics and learning how to remember the name. Okay, next slide. Also, if you find something new that you don't know what it is, always ask your local invasive species committee. Prevention is best when it comes to invasive plants. But if it's not prevented and you see something weird growing, please tell us. We would rather identify 100 common plants than miss the one plant that could be the next Myconia. So please think of us as a resource and we will get the plant identification for you. Next slide. Or you can tag an expert botanist like Kevin. So Kevin is seen here looking intensely with interest at this grass that he and I found outside of Volcanoes National Park. So if you're on iNaturalist, you can tag him right here at Kevin Faccenda, or you can email him and we'll have the email at the end of the talk. Okay, done.
So our next myth, iNaturalist is the best. We may have made this myth up, but it's absolutely true. In terms of the plant identification apps, this one is definitely the one that we recommend, and I'll explain why on the next slides. So it's the best, it has the best CV, computer vision algorithm, as I already talked about. It destroys the other ones in terms of Hawaiian plant ID. The other ones may be better in temperate areas, but in Hawaii, iNaturalist is definitely the best. And also, all of the data that iNaturalist processes is made public for citizen science. So tracking the spread of invasives, mapping where different natives occur, and all the data that goes into it is used to update the computer vision algorithm for identifying plants. So last month, they added 1,500 more species to the computer vision algorithm that it can now identify. And also, when people upload these things, you can see sometimes weird plants get uploaded. And I found several new plants for Hawaii that have never been seen here before because somebody uploaded them to iNaturalist. And I was like, that looks really weird. And then I went to the location or sent a friend to the location if it was a different island and got a specimen made, put it in the herbarium, and figured out that it's a brand new invasive species. It also works for all organisms in the computer vision. So you can upload pictures of birds, bugs, fish, emu, whatever you'd like, and it'll try to identify them. So it's not just for plants. It's also entirely free, although they do appreciate donations. And it has no ads, whereas some of the other apps like Picture This or Leaf Snap were very aggressive with their loud video ads. iNaturalist has none of these. And IDs are also usually confirmed by real humans. So you get the CV ID and then also a human ID to support that ID and make sure like the data is really high quality and everything's identified correctly. I'll talk about that more on the next slide. So everything that gets uploaded to iNaturalist gets reviewed by volunteers. So on this photo on the right, somebody uploaded a picture of a grass, and then this other person came along and says it's probably a zoysia, and then I came along and said it's probably a zoysia matrella. So the volunteers come along. Everybody in this interaction is a volunteer coming along to help identify your plant for you. And then sometimes people will add disagreeing IDs. So this person, this icon means it was done by the computer vision. The computer vision thought it was shampoo ginger, but the computer vision was wrong in that case. And so I came along and said it's actually Hedichium, the flowering gingers. So sometimes getting an ID can also take time. In this case, it took 3 years for somebody to get the ID because all the IDs are done by volunteers. And so if your photos are low quality or 3 years ago, there wasn't much of a community of people identifying plants, which is why it took until the present for this ID to come along. But just be patient, and if you want IDs on your things, contribute IDs to someone else's, and they can reciprocate. And people will, as I mentioned before, people will disagree, and so this person identified this is a hypericum, and then people came along and said, no, it's not that, and don't take anything like that personally, because people are trying to improve and help you identify your plant. So iNaturalist isn't just about plant ID. It's about helping people interact with nature. And part of that is knowing what nature you're interacting with by giving it a name. So helping the observer know what they've seen, but also identifying, you learn a lot about different plants that you've never seen before, or different growth forms that you've never seen before. Maybe this plant can have different flower colors that you've never seen. So the whole point of iNaturalist is about learning about nature and interacting with nature, kind of through the lens of identification. And then when somebody comes along and adds a disagreeing ID, what you can do is hit this withdrawal button and say that their ID is probably better than yours, and you accept that new ID. Another thing when you're using iNaturalist, what I recommend is if you don't know what you're uploading, to use the computer vision suggestion as the ID that you upload with your photo. If you leave the ID field blank, it'll take a long time for people to add an ID to it because it kind of gets put in a different pile if it doesn't have a name on it. So I recommend using the suggestion ID unless you know that is wrong. And then you can always withdraw that ID later if somebody comes along and corrects you. And also on iNaturalist, another thing is use the website version. The apps are not that great. That's all I've got. Thanks.
Thanks, Kevin. And just to wrap things up, I think we're almost done here. So thanks for everyone for hanging in there. And to finish, like I hope we've all convinced you that in spite of how great some of these apps are, the ubiquity and ease of the technology, you may think that poor botanists will be put out of work, but as I think we saw in the little sneak preview we just got, next slide, please. That is a myth. And I'm not just saying that because I have a botany degree. Plant apps are getting better, but as you just saw, they're still improving and they're not perfect. So even with the apps, the following are still true. We're going to still need taxonomists to describe new species, to collect and verify voucher specimens. We still need people like Kevin and other professionals to confirm the identities of all the apps or all the pictures on the plant apps. And the apps are only as good as the photos that are readily available or the reviewers that can confirm the ID. So botanists won't have to look for work anytime soon. Next slide, please. So you may think that botany and taxonomy are synonymous, that all botanists are taxonomists or that identify plants. Next slide, please. That's also obviously a myth. That is definitely one aspect of botany, but it's not the only one. Next slide, please. Taxonomy is just one aspect of botany, and here's a non-exhaustive sample of some of the other careers and specialized areas of study requiring training in botany. So if you're interested in plants and you want to pursue this professionally, there's many, many, many options for you to pick from, not just identifying plants. Next slide, please. Botanists are still needed. What's going to happen when civilization collapses and all these fancy apps stopped working? Well, we're still going to need botanists to identify edible and poisonous plants, and they're going to be, royalty in this post-apocalyptic environment. Next slide, please. And you never know when a botanist or a botany degree will come in handy, or it could even save your life. Next slide, please. And finally, there might come a day, or there likely will come a day, when an android equipped with AI and plant identification skills comes in an appealing and lifelike package. But until that time comes, I'd argue that it's still much more rewarding to interact with a living, breathing botanist. And with that, I think we will go to the last slide. And we want to present you folks who are hanging in there with us with a little challenge. So last slide, please, or second last slide. I think this is the stats from iNaturalist, which shows Kevin as the top identifier and the top plant picture submitter in iNaturalist in his weight class and in all weight classes. So we want to, challenge you folks to adopt and use iNaturalist and see if you can make it into the top 5, because the more people that contribute, better and better it gets. And the more quickly we'll all be able to get our plants identified. And I think that might be it. So if there's still time and people are willing, we're ready to take some questions.
I would like to say about the last picture that we saw, that was Kevin trying to get his Wi-Fi signal to upload plants to iNaturalist outside of Volcanoes National Park. Like, that's how hard he tries to help train the AI. He's a hard worker.
Wow, we need that level of commitment for sure. Okay, we're pretty much at the end of time here. There was so much to say about plants. Kavehi has put our panelists' emails into the chat. So if you have some burning questions that you want to have answered by one of our fantastic botanists here, please go ahead and check out that what's in the chat. I see Rob is asking for Kevin's email. So there you go. That question's been answered. And I'll just do a really quick check with Sibley over on Facebook to see if any questions have come in on Facebook that we could wrap up really quickly. Sibley, do you see anything over there?
We don't have any questions on Facebook.
Okay, Great. That's good because we're at the end of time. But again, you have those emails. Maybe want to just copy those and paste them on your notes or on a sticky somewhere on your desktop, because you might not have a plant question now, but in 2 weeks you'll be like, who are those people that we saw in that webinar? Because now all of a sudden I'm in my backyard and I have a plant question. I want to thank all of our panelists, our presenters, Kevin, Chuck, Molly, so much. You guys did an amazing job, and we're so stoked that you were able to do this for us. And to Kavehi and Sibley, who are handling our tech, thank you guys so much. And to everyone who joined us here on a rainy Tuesday night in East Hawaii to learn more about plants. We really appreciate you. Don't forget, we have that poll coming up and that little survey that's going to pop up after this closes. Please answer those questions. That would mean a lot to us. If anybody has any last thoughts they want to share, I know we were all giving a shout out to iNaturalists. Is that our final thought?
We have a comment on Facebook from Robert Yagi. He says, just wait till the apps find out that sedges have edges.
Some botany humor there. Chuck appreciated that. Awesome.
Or describing what makes a plant pop. Like, does it have an edge? Say that so that people can figure it out. It sounds silly, but it's true.
Nice. I like that thought. Okay. With that, with a little botany humor, we will end tonight. And once again, thank you for joining us for Hawaii Invasive Species Awareness Month 2023. Really hope you guys can take a look at some of the other webinars that we offer, and have a fantastic rest of your week.
Good night, everyone.